The sound of crushing metal echoed through the courtyards of Jerusalem in 715 BC, sending a profound shockwave through the high clergy. King Hezekiah wasn't smashing the idol of an enemy empire. The sledgehammer of the Israeli government was coming down mercilessly on a sacred relic commissioned by God Himself and forged by the very hands of Moses. The Bronze Serpent, the same artifact that saved thousands of lives from an agonizing death in the wilderness, had turned inside out. That historical piece wasn't stolen by invaders or swallowed by the sands of time. It survived intact for 7 centuries, only to undergo a bizarre mutation. From an absolute symbol of healing, it morphed into a spiritual cancer so lethal that it had to be summarily erased from existence. How did the greatest divine intervention of the past become the curse of an entire nation? The human mind has a terrifying and incredibly predictable system failure. We are absolutely addicted to worshiping what we can touch. If you pause to analyze the history of civilization, you'll realize that our need to materialize the invisible has always been our greatest Achilles heel. And the story of the Bronze Serpent, my friends, isn't just an ancient tale about snake venom in the desert. It is, without a shadow of a doubt, the greatest biblical case study on the anatomy of the corruption of faith. To understand the gravity of King Hezekiah's decision and the shock it caused, we need to look at the root of the problem. That metal object was designed and forged in the middle of an unforgiving desert as a literal shock therapy. It was a very short-term divine intervention, created with a surgical goal: to stem the agonizing death, swallowing the camp of Israel. The big problem, the true tragedy of this story, is that the nation made the fatal mistake of not throwing away the prescription once the illness had passed. They kept the medicine bottle in the back of the drawer. They idolized the bottle until the cure itself became a poison far more dangerous than the fangs of the serpents. What we're going to do here today is the autopsy of a lethal idolatry. We will trace, step by step, how a rustic, raw, and heavy piece of metal not only survived its original purpose, but took on a life of its own in the minds of the people. Think about the absurdity of the situation, the blind logistics and emotional attachment required to carry this bronze pole through the waters of the Jordan River right into the Promised Land. It survived the bloody and turbulent era of the judges, withstood the test of time, and quietly managed to infiltrate the most shielded and sacred place in the ancient world, the courtyards of the Grand Temple of Solomon. It was there, right under the noses of Jerusalem's highest spiritual authorities, that the heresy was formalized and took its definitive shape. Moses' historical relic was baptized with a proper name, Nehushtan. The people no longer saw it as a historical memorial of a past deliverance. It had become an outsourced deity. People started burning incense to the object, psychologically enslaving the exact same souls that the Creator's original design intended to set free. It is absolute proof that when human beings turn a blessing into an idol, spirituality rots. How did an inanimate piece of bronze manage to compete with God Himself inside Jerusalem? What happens in the psyche of an entire nation to transform a genuine miracle documented in the Scriptures into an active channel of pagan magic and spiritual blindness? That is exactly what we are going to unravel right now, dissecting the bizarre timeline of this relic that had to be destroyed, But before we take our next step toward the scorching sands of the wilderness of Zin, I have a very special request. If you value this kind of content, which respects your life experience and investigates the Bible with seriousness and documentary backing without making things up, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to our channel. While you're at it, scroll down to the comments. Write your name and your age. I really want to know who the sharp-minded people are that are joining me on this historical journey. Think of the wilderness of Zin. Forget that poetic image of soft sand dunes we usually see in movies. We are talking about a wasteland of jagged rocks, relentless heat by day, and bone-chilling cold at night. The atmosphere in the camp of Israel was heavy. The people were exhausted, impatient, and the murmuring had reached a boiling point. The dissatisfaction was universal, a true ticking time bomb ready to explode against Moses' leadership and against God himself. The divine response to this rebellion, however, didn't come in the form of an enemy army marching with swords and chariots. The punishment came crawling silently through the sand. The Bible describes that the camp was invaded by what the sacred text calls fiery serpents. And this is where we need to take a step back and understand the biology and linguistics behind this term, because we aren't dealing with a fire-breathing mythological monster. The original Hebrew term uses the word seraph, which is directly linked to the idea of burning, of setting on fire. But the fire wasn't in the reptile's mouth. The fire was in its venom. Scholars and toxicologists who analyze the fauna of that arid region between the Sinai Peninsula and the Araba Valley point to incredibly lethal vipers, like the saw-scaled viper or the horned viper. The bite of these snakes isn't like an ordinary serpent that merely paralyzes its prey. The venom has a devastating hemotoxic and cytotoxic action. What does that mean in the cold light of medical facts? It means the toxin causes brutal necrosis, destroying the flesh and tissues of the human body. The bite area swells absurdly, the inflammation is extreme, and the circulatory system goes into a painful collapse. The victim literally feels as if boiling acid is coursing through their veins. Their blood boils, burning the person from the inside out. It is exactly this lethal fever and this sensation of fire consuming the arteries that earned these predators the terrifying nickname of fiery serpents. Now, transport your mind inside that camp and try to visualize the scale of the despair. We are talking about thousands upon thousands of nomads living crammed in tents, entirely vulnerable. When the sun went down and the desert darkness swallowed the landscape, absolute terror took over. Think about the psychological torment of not even being able to see your executioner. The Israelite wasn't facing an enemy soldier who could be fought openly with a spear or a shield. He was lying in the dark, listening to the piercing screams of pain coming from the neighboring tent. Someone had just been bitten. A few minutes later, you would hear the desperate cries of a mother, the mourning of a father. The serpents slithered stealthily under the canvas, hiding among blankets, baskets, and belongings scattered across the dirt floor. With any false step, any sudden movement in the dead of night, death sank its teeth into a heel. The entire camp turned into a colossal death trap, where simply closing your eyes to sleep became an incalculable risk. That wasn't just a physical punishment, it was mass psychological torture. The pride and arrogant complaints of the people were quickly swallowed by a state of pure, visceral panic. The nation of Israel was held hostage by invisible predators in the sand, and the rudimentary medicine of the time was absolutely useless against the venom setting their veins on fire. Complete chaos had set in, and for the poisoned, the clock of life was rapidly running out. With the Israelite camp transformed into a literal open-air morgue, Moses' patience and leadership were stretched to their absolute limits. The people, now broken and swallowed by panic, finally dropped their guard of arrogance and cried out for mercy. Moses, stepping once again into the role of mediator for a shattered nation, goes seeking a divine answer. And this is exactly where the biblical narrative takes a turn that completely runs over our human logic. When we are sick and desperate, we expect an obvious antidote, an intervention that sweeps the problem away in the blink of an eye. But the Creator's prescription was a bitter pill to swallow. God didn't send a rainstorm to annihilate the vipers in the sand. He ordered something that sounded like a ruthless psychological test. Forge a metal serpent and hang it up high. Think about the absurd weight of that command. The Lord was asking them to craft the exact image of the executioner that was decimating the families of Israel. We need to dismantle a dangerous historical fallacy right now. The naive idea that the bronze serpent was some sort of magical amulet, an enchanted talisman in the vein of pagan cultures. If you analyze the sacred text with documentary rigor, you'll realize that the raw metal in and of itself held no healing power whatsoever. There was no mystical force field radiating from that pole. What was at play was an engineering of confrontation, a shock therapy meticulously designed to break the spine of human pride. To be saved, the poisoned Israelite had to go through a terrifying physical and mental ordeal. Visualize the agony of the scene. The man is lying in the dust of his tent, his body literally on fire, the necrosis destroying his flesh, the fever melting his senses. He wants to flee from any trace that resembles the venomous shape of a snake. But the divine instruction is unyielding. If he wants to draw breath the next day, he will have to gather his last ounces of strength, drag himself outside, force his heavy eyes open, and stare fixedly at the image of his greatest trauma. It was a direct punch against the most basic instinct of survival. Our natural reaction to deep trauma is to turn our face away and run from the trigger of pain. But God demanded that they look straight at the portrait of death in order to receive life. The true healing wasn't in caressing the bronze pole or performing a ritual around it. The healing was in the brutal, visceral act of total submission. The sick person had to silence their rationality, which screamed that the prescription made no sense, and choose to trust. By forcing the people to stare at the shining metal under the scorching sun, the Creator made it clear that the antidote wasn't pharmacological. It was strictly spiritual. Raw, naked obedience was the vaccine. That mechanism instantly separated those who had genuine faith from those who preferred to die embracing their own intellectual stubbornness. If the citizen refused to look, the toxin finished the job without mercy. It was a surgical emergency intervention for the desert. The great existential drama of our species, however, is that humanity doesn't know how to throw away the packaging after the medicine is gone. The therapy worked, but the object was about to begin its macabre mutation toward lethal idolatry. By the way, if you want to dive deep and organize in your mind not only this brutal desert event, but the entire timeline of Israel in a clear and chronological way, I left a valuable recommendation for you. Check out the first pinned comment here on the video and take a look at the ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order, from Genesis to Revelation. It's spectacular, straight-to-the-point material that will help you connect all these historical fragments from end to end without any confusion. The crisis of the fiery serpents was finally stemmed. The camp gathered its dead, treated the survivors, and the divine cloud began to move again, guiding the people away from that sandy morgue. By the most elementary logic, as soon as the biological danger vanished, the medical prescription should have been summarily discarded. The most sensible step, even from a theological standpoint, would have been to throw that pole into a furnace and melt down the bronze. After all, its emergency purpose had been completely exhausted. But that's not what happened. And it's in this exact historical blind spot that the virus of idolatry finds the perfect host, the emotional memory and spiritual neediness of an entire nation. The Bible records no grand parade or exaltation cult to the serpent immediately following the miracle. The distortion was much more subtle and corrosive. The object was kept, likely packed with extreme care among the sacred utensils. It crossed the border of the Jordan River, now under Joshua's military leadership. Think about the historical weight of this relic. It set foot in the Promised Land, survived the carnage of the conquest of Canaan, and made it intact through the brutal anarchic period of the Judges. While the people plunged successively into cycles of oppression, war, and liberation, the bronze serpent remained tucked away, like a silent witness forged by the hands of the man who parted the Red Sea. With the establishment of the monarchy, the relic continued its journey. It passed unscathed through King David's relentless wars, and at the peak of Israel's golden age, found a permanent home in the courtyards of the majestic Temple of Solomon, in the heart of Jerusalem. We are talking about a massive temporal leap of nearly 700 years, 7 centuries, in which the metal alloy bravely resisted rust, enemy looting, and the dust of oblivion. But while the raw bronze survived the test of time intact, the human mind failed miserably when faced with the temptation of the tangible. This is where the narrative suffers the drastic psychological mutation we anticipated. The original generation that felt their flesh rot, that screamed in the dark tents, and that looked at the pole with tears of relief, grew old and died. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren never smelled that lethal venom. They didn't experience the paralyzing agony of the desert. All they inherited was the grandiose oral account of the miracle and a physical, cold, palpable artifact embedded in the nerve center of the religion. For this new generation, genuine gratitude for a past deliverance began to rot, giving way to a morbid and dangerous reverence. The transition always happens right under everyone's noses, disguised as respect. No one wakes up suddenly and decides to worship a piece of metal. It gains traction with the old excuse of historical preservation. This held back death. This was molded by Moses himself, they justified. Little by little, the bronze serpent was entirely disconnected from its original healing context. In the minds of the average citizen, and with the dangerous complicity of a complacent priestly elite, that artifact stopped being a mere signpost of a divine event. It was promoted to the status of an independent god. The people forgot the non-negotiable rule of the shock therapy. The bronze never cured anyone. Salvation lied exclusively in the act of obedience. But the system failure of the human brain screamed much louder. It is infinitely more comfortable to touch, revere, and place your hopes in a passive sculpture than to submit to the will of an invisible, demanding creator. The virus of idolatry, incubated silently for centuries, reached its lethal stage. The object that once blocked physical death in the sand was now poisoning the soul of Israel in a devastating way, setting the stage for Jerusalem's greatest religious madness. We've reached the point of no return. The clock of history now reads the end of the 8th century BC, and we are in the bustling streets of Jerusalem under the reign of Hezekiah. The scenario we are about to investigate is, bluntly put, one of the most grotesque and disturbing pictures in the entire biblical narrative. And I dare say that what happened in those sacred courtyards is a terrifying mirror of our own human stubbornness. That object, which spent the last 700 years incubating a silent virus in the minds of the people, was now center stage. The heresy was no longer a veiled detour. It was institutionalized, endorsed, and practiced in broad daylight. You, with your wisdom and life experience, know full well that corruption never happens at the snap of a finger. It is built piece by piece, concession by concession. And the clergy of Jerusalem, the theological elite who should have been the relentless guardians of the nation's moral compass, decided to turn a blind eye. Perhaps out of pure political convenience, perhaps to avoid clashing with popular tradition, or simply out of cowardice, the priests allowed the sacred line to be crossed. The book of 2 Kings records in a bare documentary fashion that the Israelites were burning incense to the Bronze Serpent. We need to hit the brakes and understand the extreme gravity of this act. In the culture of the ancient Near East, burning incense wasn't like lighting a room deodorizer. Incense was the ultimate symbol of prayer, unconditional reverence, and exclusive worship. It was a sacrifice of aroma that was meant to belong solely and exclusively to the Creator. But the perfumed smoke was rising toward an old wooden stake and a rusted piece of metal. The insanity reached its psychological peak when the people, lulled by ignorance, decided to give the object a proper name. They baptized it Nehushtan. The etymology behind that word is fascinating and, at the same time, a slap in the face. It's a Hebrew pun that mixes Nahash, serpent, and Nehoshet, bronze. But the original tone carries a formidable derogatory weight. It literally means a little piece of bronze. Look at the sharp irony of history. The nation was on its knees, emotionally enslaved, handing over the keys of its devotion to a mere little piece of bronze, treating it as if it were an active sovereign deity. That rustic artifact, forged in the dust out of Moses' desperation, was now competing head-to-head with God himself, and worst of all, right inside the official headquarters of the religion. The Bronze Serpent had become the fast track, the shortcut of Israelite spirituality. It is infinitely more convenient to burn incense to a statue than to bow down, repent, and live out the moral righteousness demanded by the invisible God. Nehushtan didn't demand social justice for orphans. It didn't enforce honesty on merchants' scales. And it didn't ask for family fidelity. It was a mute and static God, exactly the kind of pet idol the human heart loves to manufacture to soothe its conscience without ever having to change its ways. The theological explanation behind this deviation reveals a terrifying danger. The serpent was no longer, under any circumstances, a historical memorial from the wilderness. It had undergone a complete mutation, becoming an active channel for blindness and pagan magic. The people imported the cheap mentality of Canaanite fertility cults and applied it to a sacred object. They turned divine intervention into sorcery. In the rigid minds of those people, power no longer resided in heavenly mercy. It was bottled up in copper and tin. They firmly believed that if they made enough smoke, the serpent would grant them health, rain, and protection like a gigantic amulet. The curse settled in with devastating force. The exact tool that once blocked the venom and rescued life was now injecting a far more destructive ideological poison into the arteries of Israel. The nation was ailing again, suffering from necrosis of the soul. They were poisoned, but this time the predator wasn't crawling through the sand. It was erected on a pedestal, being applauded and pampered by its own victims. The diagnosis was terminal. The cure would require a ruthless and unprecedented measure, setting the stage for King Hezekiah to swing the axe against the corrupted sacred. Hezekiah's reign begins with a massive cleanup operation. When he takes the throne of Judah in mid-715 BC, he inherits not only a kingdom squeezed by external military threats, he inherits a sick nation up to its neck in spiritual necrosis. And looking out at the courtyards of the majestic Temple of Jerusalem, the king faces the epicenter of this infection. There it was, the Bronze Serpent, the miraculous artifact from the desert, now elevated to the status of a deity, drowned in incense smoke and receiving fervent prayers under the bizarre nickname of Nehushtan. Hezekiah, endowed with a ruthless clarity that his era's priestly elite lacked, comes to a crushing conclusion. The only way to heal the nation now was to destroy the first cure. So we can grasp the shock of this moment, we need to understand the extreme audacity of the king's attitude. We aren't talking about tearing down the statue of a false foreign god like Baal or Asherah. That would be standard procedure, the bread and butter of any religious reform in Israel. But Hezekiah raised his hand against an incalculable historical heritage. He was about to destroy a sacred relic that had been commissioned by God himself and forged with sweat and fire by the hands of Moses. Try to imagine the magnitude of the taboo. It's the equivalent of someone grabbing a sledgehammer today and smashing the Ark of the Covenant in a public square. The pressure from the high clergy and the more conservative wing of Jerusalem must have been deafening. Have you lost your mind? That is sacred. That saved our ancestors in the desert. The outcry to preserve the object must have echoed fiercely through the palace hallways. But Hezekiah wasn't a politician who minced words. He didn't give in to cheap diplomacy. He didn't order the serpent to be discreetly removed from the courtyard and locked in the temple basements. He didn't build a museum of Exodus antiquities so the piece could be safely admired behind a glass case. The Bible records a physical, violent, and definitive action. He broke it into pieces. The axe of the Israeli government came down with no pity or mercy on the ancient bronze. Picture the cinematic scene, the piercing sound of metal being smashed against the stone floor of the temple, the sharp blows, the relic bending, cracking, and shattering into splinters as the crowd watched in stun, holding their breath. Every swing of Hezekiah's sledgehammer was a direct strike against collective ignorance. That brutal act wasn't vandalism. It was the greatest lesson in practical theology in the Old Testament. By shattering Moses' handiwork in front of everyone, Hezekiah completely drained the mystical aura surrounding the object. When the dust settled and the people looked at the floor, they didn't see a fallen god. They saw only scrap metal, a lifeless pile of copper and tin. The king rubbed the true meaning of Nehushtan right in Jerusalem's face. It was just a little piece of bronze. It didn't bleed, it didn't speak, it didn't listen, and most importantly, it absolutely saved no one. The final realization that Hezekiah cemented in history is a warning that echoes strongly to this day. No relic, no monument, no tradition, no matter how sacred, beautiful, and miraculous it might have been in the past, has the right to become greater than the purpose for which it was created. Israel's mistake was trying to bottle up divine power in a physical form that could be lazily manipulated and worshipped. The shattering of the corrupted sacred was a reality check. The true healing of that day wasn't in looking at the bronze, but in having the visceral courage to crush it, reducing to dust the illusion that we can replace the Creator with anything our hands can touch. The Bronze Serpent remains the greatest and most striking psychological warning in all of the Old Bible. The outcome of this story is irrefutable proof that our almost desperate need to touch the sacred can easily turn any blessing into a deadly trap. That rustic piece of metal fulfilled its original purpose in the wilderness of Zin in a matter of days. It was a shock therapy, a very short-term spiritual antidote for an unprecedented crisis. But its prolonged survival, crossing more than 700 years unjustifiably, was what nearly poisoned the soul of Israel beyond repair. When King Hezekiah's axe came down hard and smashed the bronze in the courtyards of the Temple of Jerusalem, the impact reverberated far beyond that era. The monarch wasn't just sweeping away an antique or destroying an old piece of metal forged by Moses. That violent strike was breaking into 1,000 pieces the dangerous human illusion that divine power can be bottled up. The sledgehammer shattered the arrogant idea that grace can be controlled, tamed, and worshipped in the form of a passive statue. Hezekiah made it clear that faith doesn't fit inside a talisman, no matter how historical or miraculous it might have been in the past. The great tragedy of Nehushtan is realizing that idolatry, most of the time, is not born out of pure malice, but out of a gratitude that has rotted over time. The healed people made the fatal mistake of forgetting the doctor to fall in love with the prescription. The final lesson that echoes from the splinters of that destroyed artifact is harsh, but absolutely liberating. In the desert, physical healing demanded that the people have the audacity to open their eyes and face the serpent raised on the pole. But centuries later, the true spiritual healing of an entire nation was no longer in looking reverently at the bronze. The definitive cure lied in having the courage to destroy it.